So let's talk about Clinton's domestic policies, since this was his primary focus. Clinton engages in a number of attempts at reform of domestic policies, some of which lean a little bit more liberal, some of which lean a little bit more conservative. One thing that we today probably wouldn't view as progressive as it was in the 90s was the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military. So the don't ask, don't tell policy continued the military's tradition of banning open LGBTQ service members from the service. However, the change that Don't Ask, Don't Tell makes is by allowing these individuals to serve so long as they are not out. So, in other words, earlier there was this attempt to actively try to find and eject from service LGBTQ individuals. Now, the focus is going to be on not pursuing separation from the armed forces unless the individual does something to openly out themselves. So, in other words, you could still serve if you're closeted. And again, in our military today, where um, LGBTQ people, well, not so much the T, because we're still struggling to come up with transgender service policies that are equitable. But for the most part, other than transgender folks, today's military allows people to serve openly and to be open about their sexual orientation as well. But Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a baby step forward towards today's policy in the military, allowing open service. One of the things that Clinton does expand was an earlier program which had begun under Gerald Ford called the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, which was basically cash for low-income workers that arrived in the form of a tax rebate. So Clinton's going to expand the program, and this helps boost an additional 4 million people out of poverty over the time of Clinton's time in office. However, Clinton is also going to revamp welfare and in many cases make it a little bit harder for people to access welfare. The Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which had been established in the Great Depression, had tried to be revamped by Richard Nixon unsuccessfully, was abolished by Clinton's administration. And instead, in its place, the Clinton administration replaced it with a system of block grants to states. So basically, this meant that these were chunks of change that were earmarked for states to spend on welfare, with some stipulations, some guidelines, right? But otherwise, states were allowed to determine a lot of the details themselves. So what this meant is it's going to look a lot like what happens with Social Security aid, is that some states will embrace policies that are more generous in allowing people to qualify, more generous with the distributed funds. Other states, not so much. So you have a similar thing happen with welfare as you do with Social Security benefits. Need-based Social Security benefits across states is a very uneven application depending upon where in the United States you live. And while the number of people who qualified for welfare and were on welfare did drop, the poverty rate didn't budge. Again, this is not boosting people out of poverty, it's just kicking more people off of welfare. There were attempts at healthcare reform in 1993. Access to healthcare had been an increasing problem for Americans. And in the 1980s, insurance companies, to save money, had embraced policy plans called HMOs. So, an HMO insurance policy means that in order to make sure that the insurance company is not spending a lot of money on your care, everything that you need to get is access through your primary healthcare provider. So, in other words, let's say you busted your knee. You'd have to first get an appointment with your primary care provider. Then they'd have to inspect it, give you a referral to a specialist, in this case, an orthopedic surgeon, right? If you've busted your knee. And the insurance company can approve or disapprove that referral. Sometimes the decisions of an HMO make sense, sometimes they don't. I could tell you stories from my family's experience with HMOs similarly. So the idea was that HMOs made it difficult to navigate because there are a lot of red tape. Insurance companies oftentimes would deny levels of care. And then the other problem was a lot of these insurance plans were tied to your employment status. So, in other words, you had to be employed full time in order to maintain insurance benefits. It's very difficult to get insurance if you worked part time or not at all, as is the case today. We do have the Medicare and Medicaid system for the elderly and the poor, but again, otherwise, most Americans had to rely on employer offered health care if they could get it. So Hillary Rodham Clinton, the First Lady, helped lead a group that looked at the healthcare systems in places like Canada and Western Europe that had embraced universal healthcare. And they proposed a plan that looked like universal healthcare, but also looked a lot like giant HMOs. So basically, it was a hybrid system, part public, part private. The plan died in 1994 due to complexity. There were a lot of Democrats who argued that it was too complicated and it didn't give enough care to those who needed it. A lot of Republicans who objected to the government's role in the universal access part of it. And there were a lot of concerns also over expanding government authority in the healthcare sector and opposition from insurance and medical associations. So, lack of insurance is still a problem that plagues many Americans today, most notably in this current time, as of recording, of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's very disturbing that some people die wondering what these medical bills are going to mean for their family. Like, that should not be the thing that you think about when you die. And we're still trying to figure out the healthcare system, but I hope and I pray that the pandemic has made people see that the current system is not so much working. We still have people reliant on employers for health insurance. We still have high healthcare prices, and everybody should have access to care. That's my personal opinion. Your mileage may vary. Okay. But actually, access to healthcare is one of the United Nations definitions of human rights. So, moving forward. Not everybody was happy with Clinton's first 2 years in office. Clinton's first term was a little bit of a slow burn, and as typically happens in midterm elections, the Republicans did very well in the elections of 1994, winning control of both the House of Representatives and Senate for the first time since the 1950s. This elevated Newt Gingrich, a representative from Georgia, to become Speaker of the House. And Gingrich declared a contract with America that in exchange for the United States, for Americans voting in a Republican Congress, that we would respond to this support by shrinking the government, slashing taxes and regulation, ending affirmative action, and revamping welfare, which was still in the planning stages at this point. And in pursuit of that, Congress published a proposed budget, with very deep cuts to social programs, including Medicare. When Clinton and Congress could not agree on the budget, particularly the sticking point was the Medicare cuts, with no new budget approved, the government shut down in December of 1995. It was not as long of a shutdown as the most recent one. However, this was a fairly radical move for the government to shut down at this point in time. Sadly, it's become a little bit more common. But Congress and Gingrich, as the Speaker, the public face of the House, ended up taking blame for the shutdown by refusing to negotiate with Clinton. So Clinton is seen as the more reasonable person, again, defending a very popular program of Medicare. And so the shutdown was largely blamed on Republicans, that voters liked Republican ideas, but not so much the tactics that they were trying to employ. Now, on foreign policy, as I mentioned, Bill Clinton is very similar to Jimmy Carter. And he really wants to focus on human rights, and in particular, ending long-term conflicts. There were attempts at peace talks in the Middle East. In 1993, the Clinton administration supported the Oslo Accords, which recognized for the first time the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the representative of the Palestinian people, and seemed to create a roadmap for peace in Israel. Clinton held talks at Camp David to try to bring both sides, Israel and Palestine, to a peaceful resolution, but both sides broke promises, and attempts to get this peace failed. In Rwanda, the Clinton administration was slow to respond to reports of genocide, where almost 1 million people were killed and 2 million became refugees in an ethnic conflict that stretched into full-blown genocide. And because of this, Clinton was a little quicker to respond to what was happening in the Balkans. So Yugoslavia, which was a formerly communist nation, when the communists collapsed in Yugoslavia, Yugoslavia broke up into many smaller states. And during this transition, this opened a lot of ethnic tensions. And this prompted genocide in places like Bosnia, where Muslims were attacked by Serbs and targeted with what the Serbs called ethnic cleansing, which is another way to say genocide. It's the same exact thing. So American forces became involved with NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to intervene to try to stem this genocide, to respond quicker, which was much necessary than they had in Rwanda. And this desire to promote peace in the Balkans will lead to several rounds of the United States participating in United Nations peacekeeping forces, for example, in 1999 in Kosovo, to prevent the expansion of violence. Now, in focusing on human rights, Clinton is not only doing this because he did show an open admiration for Jimmy Carter, but also because human rights organizations had grown tremendously since the 1970s. Many human rights organizations argued that human rights covered women's rights, indigenous rights, and access to healthcare, as I mentioned, and that human rights violations by nations should prompt military intervention by the international community. Previously, there had been a great reluctance by nations to get involved and intervene over what another nation was doing at home. That was considered a violation of national sovereignty. But with multiple genocides happening in the 20th century, with most notably the Holocaust, or the genocide against Jewish, an attempted genocide against Roma people during World War II, with genocide in Guatemala and Rwanda, in the Balkans, there is this growing sense of, if we are looking at genocide, this is an excuse to get involved, to intervene. The push for human rights also led to an increase in using international courts to prosecute people for human rights violations, most notably those of genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda. And as I mentioned, Clinton's wheelhouse is not going to be primarily foreign policy, but for the most part, domestic. But when he does get involved in foreign policy, he clearly learned his lesson from the failure to act quickly in Rwanda, and is going to continue to abide by the Jimmy Carter-esque policy of human rights first. So we're going to stop there for today. When we come back, we're going to discuss the 1990s. We're going to talk about economy. We're going to talk about culture wars. And of course, we're going to talk about a little scandal involving Bill Clinton and impeachment. All right, until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher. Have a great day.